Let's set the scene. We're in the year 1571, in an underground chamber somewhere beneath the Alexandrova Kremlin.
And the air in that chamber. The sources describe it as thick enough to choke on.
Right. It's this mix of smells. You've got the sharp tang of cold iron tools, the sweetness of burnt incense from the monks who were always around.
And something else. One account just calls it something organic and wrong, a smell that catches in the back of your throat.
It's the smell of dread, institutionalized dread. And at the center of it all is a 19-year-old girl named Marfa Vasilva Sobakina.
Marfa. And you have to understand, just 12 days before this moment, she was the Tsarina of all Russia.
The winner of the Tsar's biggest, most elaborate bride show. And now she's in this chamber, awaiting what the records call an examination.
By Ivan the Terrible's personal agents, the tools are laid out: pincers, strange copper implements, glass vials. It's a terrifying scene.
And the men watching her are the oprichniki.
Ah, yes, the infamous oprichniki. Ivan's personal enforcers, dressed in black, riding with a dog's head and a broom on their saddles.
Symbols for sniffing out treason and sweeping it away.
Exactly. But when you really dig into the records, you see a pattern. The enemies they were sent to bite, the treason they swept away. So often, it revolved around the women in Ivan's immediate orbit.
And that scene, that incredible rapid fall from the throne to a torture chamber, that really defines the problem we're going to tackle today.
It does, because history gives us this simplified version of Ivan the Terrible.
Right. Conqueror of Kazan, centralizer of the state, the guy who killed his own son in a fit of rage. We know those stories.
But the full story, the one that's been systematically suppressed or just softened over the last 450 years, is the story of the women in his life.
We're talking about a man who had at least 7 wives, maybe 8.
And every single one of those marriages ended in the woman's premature death, her disappearance, or her being forced into a convent for life.
And if that happens once, it's a tragedy. Twice. You could call it a really dark coincidence.
But 7 or 8 times, that's not a coincidence. That is a pattern that demands a different kind of investigation.
So that's our mission in this deep dive. We're not looking at this as a romantic tragedy or just a psychological drama about a mad king.
No, we are investigating a system.
We want to uncover the methodical, almost bureaucratic efficiency Ivan used to identify, isolate, break, and then dispose of these women.
And we can do that because we have the evidence. We have surviving court records, reports from horrified foreign diplomats, and most importantly, we have modern forensic analysis of the women's actual remains.
So the question we're asking is, how was this destruction of women institutionalized? How did it become state policy?
We're moving past the easy label of madness and focusing on the method, because the suffering of Marfa Sobakina and all the others, it wasn't just random cruelty.
It was a calculated part of how we governed.
It was policy.
Okay, so let's unpack this system. And to do that, you have to start at the beginning with the selection process, the infamous Russian bride show.
Right, the smotriny. Now, Ivan didn't invent this. It was an old tradition for a czar to pick a bride from a big pool of noble daughters.
But he perfected it, or twisted it into something else entirely.
He turned it into a monstrously efficient machine. It was part beauty pageant, part political calculation, and frankly, part livestock auction. He turned these young women into specifications on a piece of paper.
And the first clue that this was a system is just the sheer scale of it.
The scale is staggering. For his second bride show back in 1561, the sources say about 1,500 young women were summoned to Moscow for the initial inspections.
1,500. And that wasn't even the biggest one.
No. As his paranoia grew, the numbers went up. By 1571, for the show where Marfa Sobakina was chosen, the initial summons went out to over 2,000 families.
From every corner of the Tsardom, not just the big Moscow families.
No, from everywhere. Minor nobles in distant provinces. And you have to understand, refusal wasn't really an option.
I was going to ask about that. You couldn't just say, no thank you?
I mean, technically, maybe, but if a noble family refused to send their daughter, what message are they sending? That they're too proud, that they're disloyal. It was basically a death sentence for the family's reputation and maybe for the family itself.
So the women were essentially hostages to their family's political standing from the very beginning.
Long before a single one was even selected. And what's really disturbing is the bureaucratic detail that went into the selection. This wasn't just Ivan looking for a pretty face.
The surviving records show these incredibly specific criteria. It's dehumanizing.
It is. Let's run through them. Age, 15 to 23. Height and weight had to be within very narrow documented ranges.
Skin had to be completely clear of any blemishes. Hair had to be thick. Teeth, this was a big one in the 16th century, had to be perfect. even and uncorrupted.
It was a sign of health and wealth. But beyond the physical, there was behavior. Her bearing had to be dignified, but not proud. Her voice pleasing, but never loud.
But the really systematic part, the control, went so much deeper than just looks. This is where the surveillance state kicks in.
Exactly. This wasn't just about appearance. Investigators would dig into family histories for any hint of scandal or connections to Ivan's enemies.
And he had a long list of enemies.
A very long and growing list. They would interrogate household servants, probably under duress, about the girl's private behavior, her temperament, her secret opinions.
You mentioned in your research they even questioned priests about their confession patterns. How does that even work?
It's incredibly invasive. Priests were basically compelled to report on how often a girl confessed and the general nature of her sins. They were looking for any sign of ambition, of a questioning character, anything that suggested she wouldn't be completely pliable.
Wow. So they're building a complete psychological and political profile before she even leaves her hometown.
Absolutely. And based on that initial background check, about 70% of the candidates were eliminated right there at the regional level.
70%. So that leaves the top tier, maybe 500 or 600 women, who were then brought to the Kremlin for the next stage.
The Moscow evaluation stage. And this was a 3-week period specifically designed to break them down before the Tsar even laid eyes on them.
It's a process of reduction, isn't it? Turning them from people into
Products, highly documented products. They were immediately isolated from their families, housed in a special part of the Kremlin, and every single person they interacted with, every servant, every attendant, was a vetted oprychniki agent.
So every word, every tier is being reported.
Every single thing. And this is where the physical examinations become less about medicine and more about establishing dominance.
You wrote that modern gynecologists who have reviewed the descriptions of these procedures found them traumatic.
Extremely so. Even for the time, they were recognized as being excessively invasive. The goal wasn't just to check for childbearing capacity. The goal was to send a message. Your body is now state property. We will inspect it whenever and however we want.
And then came the psychological stress tests. This part is, for me, one of the most chilling aspects of the whole process.
They were remarkably sophisticated. For example, officials would deliberately stage conflicts between the candidates to see how they reacted. Would they gossip? Would they intervene?
Or they deliver false news.
What else? This was a key test. A candidate would be pulled aside and told, for instance, that her father had been arrested for treason or her younger brother was gravely ill. They were looking for a very specific reaction.
That's the right reaction.
Yeah.
It sounds like an impossible test.
It was an impossible bind. If you showed too much emotion, you were unstable, hysterical, a political risk.
But if you showed too little,
You were calculating, cold, potentially treasonous yourself. The ideal, what they were looking for, was a moment of genuine distress, followed very quickly by a composed acceptance of her duty to the Tsar above all else.
so they were actively searching for women who were preconditioned to suppress their own feelings for the sake of the state.
Exactly. And the notes they kept are just brutally cold. We have surviving examples. There's one that reads, Candidate 17, physical acceptable, teeth show minor discoloration, behavioral profile indicates strong will, potentially difficult to manage, advance with notation of concerns.
A strong will was a concern.
A major one, and you contrast that with another note. Candidate 43, exceptional specifications, pliability, and eagerness to please, confirmed after test of false family distress, primary candidate.
They're not even talking about people anymore. They're talking about specifications.
It's pure data, and so by the time you get down to the final 100 women, they're already exhausted, they're terrified, and they've been conditioned for weeks to be submissive.
And then Ivan himself makes the final choice. And this part seems completely arbitrary and designed to instill more fear.
It was the final lesson. None of that bureaucracy matters, only his whim matters. He would walk among the finalists and ask these impossible questions.
Not to get information, but just to see how they'd react.
Precisely. He might look at a girl with slightly darker features and say, I hear your grandmother had Tatar blood. Are you loyal to Holy Russia or to the Horde?
There's no right answer to that.
None. Or he'd say to another, my last wife died screaming in childbirth. Are you prepared to scream for me? It was about establishing absolute unpredictable power.
The lesson being that your entire existence, from this moment on, depends on my mood.
And that my mood can change in an instant. The entire bride show was a machine for selecting and pre-breaking a vulnerable target.
So once a woman like Marfa Sobakina is selected, she moves into the next phase. It's called preparation for the sacred duties of marriage. But it sounds more like a final stripping away of identity.
It was. This wasn't about assessment anymore. This was about transformation. It was a 2-week period designed to completely reshape her into the perfect, compliant Tsarina.
And it started with the physical. You describe it as a process of establishing her body as state property.
That's tragically accurate. She was subjected to these repeated, extensive ritual baths with so-called purifying herbs. But during these, female attendants, all loyal to Ivan, were documenting every inch of her body, noting any tiny imperfection.
It's constant surveillance.
It is. They used abrasive things to clean her teeth, special treatments for her skin and hair. All of it was about modifying her to fit a very specific ideal. And the constant intrusive medical exams continued.
The message being, you have no privacy. Your body belongs to us now.
Exactly. And at the same time, the psychological training kicks in. And this is a really chilling detail. The instructors were often female relatives of previous Tsarinas.
Women who had survived the system were now teaching the new victim how to navigate it.
It's the ultimate normalization of abuse. And they taught absolute submission. Tiny things. You walk 3 steps behind the Tsar, your eyes are always lowered, you never speak unless you're spoken to.
And you never, ever contradict him.
Under any circumstances, they were basically trained to become experts in reading his moods, to recognize the subtle signs of his rage before it exploded.
It's a state of constant vigilance. You can never relax.
Because your survival depends on correctly anticipating the whims of your abuser. And then there was the instruction on the private duties of the marriage bed.
The surviving fragments about this are pretty grim.
They are. It wasn't about love or partnership. It was training in total submission. She was taught to accept whatever he demanded, refuse nothing, and crucially, to project an image of willingness.
One source from the time says, our feelings were irrelevant.
And that resistance wasn't just disloyal, it was a sin. So when Marfa finally gets to her wedding day, she's not a joyful bride. She's been conditioned, she's careful, she's learned that she has no bodily autonomy left.
The wedding itself, in October 1571, goes off without a hitch. She performs her role perfectly. But the real test began on the wedding night.
And it was a test designed to be failed. Because Ivan didn't just want compliance, which he had been trained for. He demanded enthusiasm.
He needed to see that she welcomed his demands.
For his ego, yes. And this created what historians call the impossible bind.
Right. If she shows genuine pleasure, she's unchaste. Where did she learn those responses? She must have had a lover.
But if she's reserved or reluctant, then she's cold. She's failing in her duty to the Tsar. She's insulting him.
It's a classic no-win scenario.
And we know that within the first week, Marfa failed one of these tests. We don't know the details, but we know Ivan immediately ordered a new secret investigation into her background. He was looking for evidence of a previous lover.
And here's where the system shows its true monstrous logic. While he's investigating her, looking for a reason to get rid of her.
He's already getting rid of her. He starts having her poisoned.
The whole thing is a trap. He's murdering her while simultaneously building the legal case for why her death is justified.
And we know this for a fact because of the modern forensic analysis of her remains.
The re-examination in the 21st century, what did they find?
They found elevated levels of both arsenic and mercury in her bones and hair.
And the fact that it's in her hair is important, right? Provides a timeline.
A very clear one. Hair grows at a predictable rate. The analysis showed a massive spike in these poisons consistent with aggressive, high-dose poisoning over a period of about 2 weeks.
The exact time between her wedding and her death.
Exactly. This wasn't some accidental long-term exposure. This was a targeted, rapid poisoning.
So she dies 15 days after becoming Tsarina. And Ivan's reaction is not one of grief.
Not at all. It's one of political opportunity. He immediately launches a wave of terror, blaming her death on witchcraft.
And he targets her entire family, the Sobakinas.
Destroys them. Dozens are executed, their lands confiscated. One foreign diplomat who was there at the time wrote about it, and he saw it clearly. He basically said, the Tsar has found a new way to deal with powerful families. Marry their daughter, destroy her, and then use her death as an excuse to eliminate the family's power base.
Marfa was just a pawn.
A pawn whose death was more useful to him than her life.
That story of Marfa's rapid destruction is so shocking, but it was just one method in Ivan's arsenal. The system had a whole spectrum of cruelty. Let's look at some of the other wives, starting with Maria Temryukovna, his second wife. Her fate was what you call the slow burn.
Yes, Maria Temryukovna, a Circassian princess chosen in 1561. She was spirited, intelligent, and Ivan seemed genuinely taken with her at first. She lasted 8 years. which is a lifetime at Ivan's court.
But those 8 years sound like a masterclass in psychological torture. How did he dismantle her spirit over that long a period?
The main techniques were isolation and what we'd now call reality distortion, or gaslighting. It started subtly. He'd question her loyalty, accuse her of secretly practicing her old customs, things like that. Groundless accusations, but they planted seeds of doubt.
Then he started removing her support system.
Systematically, he dismissed her personal servants, the ones who came with her from Circassia, and replaced them with his own oprichniki agents.
So her private rooms are no longer private. They're a cell with spies.
Precisely. Then came physical separation. He moved her to an isolated wing of the Kremlin, claiming he needed solitude for state business. He intercepted her letters. All of this, he claimed, was for her own protection.
The goal is just to keep her in a constant state of anxiety where she can't trust anyone or anything.
That's the key, this cycle of suspicion followed by moments of kindness. It's designed to break a person's mind. And the final escalation was just devastating.
This was when he publicly accused her of trying to poison him.
In front of the entire court, diplomats, boyars, everyone, she collapsed in shock. And then, in this terrifying twist of psychological cruelty, he immediately retracted the accusation.
Saying it was just a test.
He said her genuine shock proved her innocence. But the damage was done. Her reputation was destroyed. Everyone had heard the charge. She lived her last 2 years in a state of, by all accounts, unbearable anxiety.
When she died at age 26, the toll was physically visible.
Witnesses said she had the face of an old woman. She was constantly trembling, couldn't sleep. Her death was probably a release from what had become an 8-year-long torture session.
Now let's contrast that slow burn with the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Maria Dolgorukaya, Ivan's fifth wife. This was instant public destruction.
Maria Dolgorukaya's story is maybe the most horrific example of the system's brutal efficiency. She was 19 from a very powerful family, the Dolgorukas, who were a political problem for Ivan.
Marriage was a political move.
A sham. And it was over almost before it began. The wedding was a grand affair. The morning after the wedding night, Ivan ordered her to be drowned.
Publicly. In the Moscow River.
Yes. Dragged from the Kremlin, weighted down, and thrown into the river by the oprichniki while the public watched. The whole thing was carried out with chilling speed.
And the official justification for this was that she hadn't been a virgin.
A claim that is almost certainly false. Remember the bride shows, the incredibly invasive examinations. It's virtually impossible that something like that would have been missed.
So it was just a pretext.
It was the legal pretext he needed. Her public execution as a deceiver gave him the justification to immediately move against her entire family.
And he wiped them out.
Mass arrests, executions, land confiscations. It was a surgical political strike. Her death sent a message to every other noble family in Russia. Your daughters are hostages. Their lives can be used to destroy you at any moment.
Then you have the case of Anna Koltovskaya, his fourth wife. She survived for a year by trying to become invisible.
Absolute self-effacement. She learned from the fates of the others. She never spoke unless spoken to, never showed any emotion, never gave him any reason to complain. She tried to become a ghost in the palace.
But in Ivan's system, even that was a failing strategy.
It was. Because a sadist who enjoys breaking people's will gets no satisfaction from someone who has no will to break. He just grew bored with her.
So he disposed of her.
Sent her to a convent at age 23. But it wasn't a peaceful retirement. She was confined to a tiny 8-by-8-foot cell for 42 years.
42 years in a single room. That's incomprehensible.
And the monastery records from her later life are heartbreaking. They refer to her as Sister Daria and say she no longer speaks except to mutter prayers, that she just made sounds sometimes. They concluded her mind had simply gone. It was a living death.
A different kind of psychological torture was used on his sixth wife, Anna Vasilchikova. The records call it correction.
Yes, Anna lasted less than a year. Her correction seems to have been a deliberate experiment in sensory deprivation. We have fragments of notes she smuggled out.
What do they say?
She describes being kept in a windowless room, so she lost all sense of day and night. Her food was brought at completely random times, sometimes twice in an hour, other times she'd wait for 2 days. She wrote, "I cannot tell if I'm going mad or if this is designed to make me mad."
It's designed to destroy your sense of reality.
And it worked. She was eventually sent to a convent where she died at 25. The official cause of death was listed as failure to thrive, a state of complete psychological collapse where the body just gives up.
Finally, there's Vasilisa Melencheva. She wasn't from a bride show. And she survived for 2 years by being the beautiful piece of furniture, until she made one tiny mistake.
One slip up. We don't know exactly what it was. Maybe she smiled at the wrong courtier. Maybe she accepted a small gift. It doesn't matter. It was the excuse Ivan needed.
And the punishment was swift and public.
Brutal. She and her alleged lover were arrested. He was impaled. She was taken to the dungeons for examination torture, which produced the required confession of adultery. Then she was drowned.
And the confession gave Ivan the moral high ground he wanted.
Exactly. He wasn't a murderer. He was a righteous husband dispensing justice. He used the language and framework of morality to disguise his political sadism.
And it's so important to understand that this system, this machinery of terror, wasn't just for his wives. It extended to the entire noble class.
Absolutely. Section 4 is about how the Oprichnina institutionalized this misogyny and turned it into a primary tool of state control.
The Oprichnina was more than a secret police. It was a state within a state.
They operated completely outside the law. They could arrest, torture, and execute anyone on the Tsar's command with zero accountability. And they quickly learned that the fastest way to break a powerful man was through his wife and daughters.
So when the Oprichnina showed up at a noble's estate to investigate treason, there was a specific protocol they followed that targeted the women.
A very clear protocol. Step 1, isolation. The man would be arrested and taken away. The wife and daughters were then confined to the house as hostages.
And then all their servants would be replaced.
Replaced by Oprichniki agents. So the women are now trapped in their own home with their captors, completely cut off from the outside world, their every move watched.
Then came step 2, interrogation.
The methods were what you'd expect from a 16th century terror state. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, threats against their children. They were questioned relentlessly about their husband's or father's activities, his friends, his private thoughts.
The goal was to get information, but also to break them down for the next step.
Exactly. Step 3, utilization. This is where the women become pure leverage.
The family pressure protocols.
If the man refused to confess, the Oprichnina would use the women to break him. They would describe to him in graphic detail what was being done to his wife or daughter. Sometimes they'd make sure he could hear their cries from his cell.
And in the most extreme cases, they would bring the women to him.
Yes. We have this one chilling document, an administrative record about the interrogation of a noble named Vorotinsky.
It reads like a memo from hell.
It does. It says, suspect male Vorotinsky refuses to confess. Recommend implementing family pressure protocols, detailed description of current treatment to suspect, followed by audio exposure, followed by visual evidence.
It's a bureaucratic checklist for torture.
It is. And the most terrifying part is the line at the end, which recommends proceeding to enhanced family pressure if the standard methods fail.
Meaning there were things so horrific they wouldn't even write them down in their own secret files.
The very absence of the words is what's so frightening. It implies a level of depravity that was just understood. The woman's body became an instrument of state policy, used to extract a confession from the man.
And then you see this entire system scaled up to an industrial level during the Novgorod massacre in 1570.
The Novgorod massacre was Ivan showing what absolute power looked like. He believed the city was going to defect to Lithuania, so he sent the Oprichnina to make an example of them. They killed tens of thousands of people.
And women and children were specifically targeted.
Yes, particularly for drowning in the frozen Volkhov River. They would cut holes in the ice and just push people in. Survivors described seeing long lines of women and children waiting their turn on the ice.
And the sources also talk about women being taken for entertainment.
A horrifying euphemism. Women were dragged into houses by Oprichniki soldiers and were often never seen again. Others were kept as household captives, basically given out as prizes or rewards to the enforcers.
They existed in this legal limbo with no rights at all.
None. They were property. It shows that the misogyny wasn't an accidental byproduct of the terror. It was a central, efficient, and intentional part of the terror itself.
As we bring this all together, we have to come back to the evidence that really cements this whole argument. The modern forensic proof that turns these stories from historical tragedy into a confirmed pattern of murder.
The re-examination of the remains in the 21st century was a complete game changer. It takes this out of the realm of rumor and speculation and grounds it in hard science.
What new technology allowed them to see what earlier examinations missed?
It was primarily advancements in trace element analysis. They could test tiny samples of hair and bone for heavy metals and concentrations that would have been undetectable before.
So they could see not just acute massive poisoning, but slow chronic poisoning over time.
Precisely. By analyzing how poisons accumulate in bone, they can see long-term exposure. And by analyzing segments of hair, they can create a timeline of exposure in the weeks and months leading up to death.
Let's start with Anastasia Romanova, Ivan's first wife, the one he supposedly loved, whose death is often blamed for his descent into madness.
Her remains showed high levels of arsenic consistent with long-term poisoning. Now, this either means his enemies poisoned her and he failed to protect her, or, more chillingly, that he was already paranoid and poisoning her himself, even during what was considered his good period. Either way, the court was a toxic environment from the start.
And for Marfa Sobakina, who lasted just 15 days.
Her hair analysis confirmed it. A massive spike of both arsenic and mercury, perfectly aligned with the 2 weeks between her wedding and her death. It's the physical proof of a rapid, deliberate murder.
So this forensic evidence is what transforms the narrative. It's no longer paranoid illness or divine judgment.
It is a pattern of premeditated murder disguised as natural illness. He was systematically killing his wives using poisons that mimic sickness, which gave him plausible deniability. The pattern always suggested it, but the science confirms it. It was method, not madness.
And modern trauma specialists, looking at this pattern, they see something very familiar.
They recognize it as a textbook case of systematic, intimate partner abuse with institutional support. The framework is terrifyingly effective.
You break it down into 4 steps. The first is selection of vulnerable targets, which is the whole point of the bride shows.
Step 2 is the establishment of absolute control over their bodies, their environment, their communication. That was the 2-week preparation phase.
Step 3 is the installation of chronic fear, the constant unpredictability, the mix of kindness and cruelty.
And step 4 is the destruction of identity through isolation and erasure, like what happened to Anna Koltovskaya in her cell for 42 years. And all of this is supported by a 5th element, the use of witnesses, the court, the oprichniki, to normalize the abuse and ensure everyone's silence.
When you look at the final statistic, that around 90% of his wives and partners died prematurely, or imprisoned or disappeared, it's undeniable.
It is statistically impossible for that to be a coincidence. It's the signature of a system.
And this system wasn't just driven by personal cruelty. It was justified by an ideology of order.
Yes. There's a letter attributed to Ivan. Its authenticity is debated, but its sentiment is revealing.
What does it say?
He essentially writes, "A wife who does not submit perfectly is a threat to the entire realm. She must be corrected or removed. There is no third option."
Wow. So a woman's independent will is equated with treason.
Exactly. Which means her destruction isn't cruelty, it's governance. Women were reduced to instruments of the state. Their suffering was just an administrative necessity. And that ideology created a template for institutional misogyny in Russia that lasted for centuries.
As we close out this deep dive, it feels necessary to say their names again, to pull them out of the footnotes of history. They were real people. Maria Temrykovna, who endured 8 years of psychological torture.
Marfa Sobakina, a bride and a queen for 15 days before being murdered by snake poison.
Maria Dolgorukaya drowned the morning after her wedding as a political tool. Anna Koltovskaya, erased from the world for 42 years in an 8x8 cell.
Anna Vasilchikova, who was driven mad by sensory deprivation until her body gave up. Vasilisa Melancheva, executed for a single unknowable mistake. And Maria Nagaya, the last wife, exiled and forgotten.
And beyond them, the thousands of nameless women of Novgorod, the wives and daughters used as leverage in the family pressure protocols.
The household captives, treated as prizes. The greatest danger with this history is the intentional erasure, the way their stories have been minimized. They weren't victims of random rage. They were victims of a methodical, institutionalized policy.
A policy of isolation, surveillance, and identity destruction.
So we want to leave you with a final thought to consider. Why is it that the truth about systematic violence against women is so often the first thing to be hidden or downplayed when we talk about historical terror?
And how does recognizing these old methods, selecting the vulnerable, creating constant fear, normalizing abuse, help us identify similar patterns of control today?
The silence around these women was enforced. The forgetting was intentional. Remembering is the only way to understand the true cost of that kind of power.